Hello. So this is another Black History Month 2023 video, this time about Nella Larsen's novel, Passing. Now, I'd said in my video about Quicksand, her other major novel, that Nella Larsen is probably my favorite Harlem Renaissance writer and one of, if not my favorite, American modernists. Part of the reason for that is Passing. Passing has a very special place in my heart, in part because it is one of the first works that I did a scholarly presentation at a major conference about. I had done some conference presentations late undergrad and into my master's program. They were mostly undergrad or graduate conferences, but at the regional MLA, Northeast Modern Language Association conference during my master's program, I presented a metacritical analysis of criticism from the 70s about Passing. Because one of the things that really struck me, I was fascinated by this novel, and one of the things that struck me about it is that when Larsen's works were sort of rediscovered in the 70s and people started reading them again, a lot of critics read same-sex desire out of Passing. For me, it was immediately obvious, and I'll talk about that in just a little bit, but a lot of critics, in my estimation, really contorted their readings of this novel to try and eliminate that same-sex desire, that lesbian, not relationship because it never comes to fruition, but that lesbian desire between Irene Redfield, who's the narrator of this novel, the protagonist, and Clare Kendry. So I found that really interesting. And because that, in the same way that, David Grieg's Oedipus the King and Tom Stoppard's Travesties in Arcadia will always be important works to me because they were some of the first things that I had published about, Passing is always going to be an important novel to me because it was at the beginning of my career as a literary scholar. So enough of that. That's my personal pointless reminiscences. So Passing is a complex and dynamic novel. Like Quicksand, it's set in the 1920s, primarily in Harlem. And it revolves around race issues. Harlem Renaissance, that's pretty par for the course. But it revolves around this idea of passing, this idea of presenting oneself as something other than what one is. And the most overt example of this is Clare Kendry. Clare, as well as Irene Redfield and a couple of their other friends, are very light-skinned. Clare also has sort of blondish hair, and she has some very substantial white ancestry, and that's part of the reason why she's as light-skinned as she is. But she has left their community in Chicago where they had grown up, and she married a white man. We come to learn his name, John Ballou. But she is passing as white. We do find out that Ballou is extremely racist, just overtly racist. Probably even by the standards of the 1920s, problematically so. But Clare is living a life as a white person. Her husband does not know that she has African American heritage. But but she reconnects with her childhood friend, Irene Redfield, and so friendship becomes a big source of tension for Irene because she's worried that Claire will be found out. There's also a lot of sort of angst and resentment because Irene is very much in this Harlem socialite and intellectual society where the race problem is regularly discussed, where people are very supportive of African American issues and things like this. We get the same kind of society in Quicksand, and so this is Irene's world, where people are in fact proud to be African American, even if it's also a source of shame for them in some ways. Again, that sort of W.E.B. Du Bois double consciousness type thing. So Irene is very concerned about Claire and about what will happen if her husband ever finds out that she's part African American. So that becomes a big portion of the thing. Toward the end of the novel, Irene becomes convinced on very, very flimsy pretexts that her husband Brian is having an affair with Claire. And so that at this sort of climax of the novel, Irene falls into this sort of despair, this angst, this place of resentment where she turns against Claire, and to a certain extent, she turns against her husband, Brian, but also is determined to keep him to maintain her stability in life. And then at the end of the novel, they're at a party with some of their friends. The Redfields have brought Claire with them because she's been coming into Harlem to spend time with African Americans without her husband knowing it. Jack Ballou shows up at this party and basically accuses her of being African American. Those are not the words that he uses, but he accuses her of being African American, and then the implication is that Irene may push Claire from an open window in this 6th-story apartment. It's not 100% clear because, as Irene says, or as the novel says, what happened next, Irene Redfield never afterwards allowed herself to remember, never clearly. One moment Claire had been there, a vital, glowing thing like a flame of red and gold. The next, she was gone. Irene seems to think that she has pushed Claire. That's the indication that we get. It's not explicitly stated, and the other characters suggest that Claire may have purposefully leaned back out the window committing suicide. So there is that ambiguity. Now, in terms of the passing element, and in terms of what I had sort of mentioned before, this same-sex desire, to me, again, you have to go really, really far out of your way to try and ignore the elements of same-sex desire in this novel. And there's a lot of instances that I can point you toward, but I think the best one comes in chapter 2 of part 2. So part 2, Re-Encounter, chapter 2, we get this bit where Claire has come to visit Irene. Irene has not responded to one of Claire's letters, basically sort of begging to come see her. And so Clare has come in person to sort of find out what's going on. Irene is in her room. Clare comes in. And basically, so I'm going to read you bits and pieces of this because I think there's some bits that we can just sort of skim over, but this is a scene that you really have to sort of shut your eyes and say, nah, I'm not seeing same-sex desire here. So it says, for Clare had come softly into the room without knocking, and before Irene could greet her, had dropped a kiss on her dark curls. Looking at the woman before her, Irene Redfield had a sudden, inexplicable rush of affectionate feeling. Then a little bit later, after sort of asking why Irene didn't answer the letter, it says, Clare went on, every day I went to that nasty little post office place. I'm sure they were all beginning to think that I'd been carrying on an illicit love affair and that the man had thrown me over. So it's even suggested, like the novel itself even says, this follows the pattern of a love affair. This follows the pattern of a sexual relationship, an illicit sexual relationship. Shortly after, so Irene tries to sort of justify not answering the letter, saying basically that it's too dangerous for them to be in contact in case her husband finds out she's African American. And Clare says, you mean you don't want me, Irene? Irene hadn't supposed that anyone could look so hurt. She said quite gently, no, Clare, it's not that. But even you must see that it's terribly foolish and just not the right thing. Now, we can read that, but even you must see that it's terribly foolish and not just the right thing. We can read that in the obvious surface way, which is you coming into Harlem is a dangerous thing. If your incredibly racist husband finds out, it will spell disaster for you, as indeed it does at the end of the novel. But we can also read that as we cannot have a same-sex affair. This is improper. And then a little bit later, it says, in spite of her determined selfishness, the woman before her was yet capable of heights and depths of feeling that she, Irene Redfield, had never known, indeed never cared to know. And so there is this suggestion, if we take a look at all of these sort of textual bits and pieces across the novel, there is this suggestion that Clare Kendry is much more at home with her same-sex desire than Irene Redfield, because Clare has this sort of femme fatale almost aspect to her personality, and she has this element where one of her dominant characteristics is that she will get what she wants. She will pursue the thing that she wants regardless of consequences. Whereas Irene Redfield's dominant trait is really that she wants security in her life. She wants that more than anything else. And that becomes a big focus of the last portion of the novel when she's convinced herself that Brian and Clare are having an affair. Part of the reason that she wants to keep her marriage with Brian is to have that security. So there is this sense that Irene is not ready to confront in herself her deep romantic longing for Clare Kendry, and that Clare is much more willing to acknowledge and maybe even act on those desires. I mean, it seems fairly overt that Clare Kendry is not coming to the Redfield household, not coming to Harlem to see Brian. She's coming to see Irene. So we've got that element of it. I think there's actually another element here that's really interesting. which is that Brian may be a closeted gay man. It's hard to tell. This one is a harder read because we don't get Brian's perspective on things. We have Irene's perspective on what Brian is doing and what motivates him. But we do get this bit. They're talking about one of their sons, Junior. They have two sons. Junior has, I guess, gotten some ideas about sex from older boys, and what it says here, Brian says, "Queer ideas," he repeated. "Do you mean ideas about sex, Irene?" So that, first thing, the fact that she calls them queer ideas and he repeats that, seems to me to be a loaded choice of terms. And actually the term queer comes up a number of times in the novel, especially when people are talking about their feelings for one another. But it says, "Queer ideas," he repeated. "Do you mean about sex, Irene?" "Yes, not quite nice ones, dreadful jokes and things like that." "Oh, I see," he threw at her. For a while there was a silence between them. After a moment he demanded bluntly, "Well, what of it? If sex isn't a joke, what is? Or what is it?" So, Brian is deeply restless. He wants to go to Brazil. That's like his big life ambition. And basically, Irene has kind of, by her own admission, forced him into this life of being a doctor, being in Harlem's sort of upper society, respectable bourgeois American culture, etc., etc. And she knows that he is deeply discontented about this. And I think the choice of Brazil is significant in this sense. I don't know that Brazil necessarily, I don't know what maybe stereotypes of Brazil existed or images of Brazil existed, but as this sort of exotic locale, carnival and things like this, these sort of celebrations that cross gender and performative lines and things like this, I think Brazil has had, or has even still today, some of these sort of associations as a place where it was maybe easier to have same-sex relationships than it was in the U.S. of the 1920s. Maybe. I don't know. That's speculation on my part. Again, we don't really get enough information about Brian and his worldview, what motivates him, etc., etc., but we know he's discontented. This relationship doesn't seem especially fulfilling, and so on and so on. But the other thing that I think really points us toward this same-sex reading, and even toward that idea that Brian is closeted, that things are not as they seem, is actually the introduction. I think Larsen is amazing at writing introductions. She writes these introductions that point us to the themes of the novel that then get developed in the whole. So the introduction, the first paragraph to this novel. It was the last letter in Irene Redfield's little pile of morning mail. After her other ordinary and clearly directed letters, the long envelope of thin Italian paper with its almost illegible scrawl seemed out of place and alien. And there was, too, something mysterious and slightly furtive about it, a thin, sly thing which bore no return address to betray the sender. Not that she hadn't immediately known who its sender was. Some 2 years ago she had one very like it in outward appearance. Furtive, but yet in some particular demanding way a little flaunting. Purple ink, foreign paper of extraordinary size. there's so much great detail here that I think points us to this idea that there is something beyond the surface appearances. That, in fact, the things that signal here, the signs of this letter, the signs of this paper, this ink, the Italian paper, the almost illegibility of the writing, all of these things point us toward a hidden meaning. And I think Larsen tells us right from that very first paragraph, be aware, be thinking about the hidden meanings, the things that are not overt, that are not obvious. Be prepared for them, because they are the things that really signify in this novel. And I think that's brilliant. I think it's an amazing opening paragraph.